is Judy Riley. I'm Jon Riley's sister. My brother, Jonathan Michael Riley, disappeared in April of 2013. So I've been trying to tell the story of the project that we were working on before John disappeared. And everyone keeps saying the same thing. We can't tell the story or we're gonna get sued. So maybe when I tell the story, it will help create enough of a ruckus that we can get access to the documents to prove that it actually happened. So it's a really difficult story to tell. It's something that happened to my brother in high school. He was the victim of a sexual assault from his band teacher. So let's go back to the beginning. John and I were at Etobicoke Collegiate High School. John and I were in the same grade, and we took a lot of the same classes, and we had the same peer group. In the 9th grade, I was 13 years old or so. We were just kids. In the 9th grade, Donstrathdee was John's music teacher, and Robertjudge was my music teacher. So these men are serial sexual predators. They have multiple victims that span decades. And my brother is the person who spoke out. So this is what happened. So the band was legendary. Sorry, it's really hard to tell this story. And they produced musicians like Jeff Healey. He's a very famous Canadian musician. And they won awards. They performed in big concerts downtown. They traveled to Hawaii. They went to Mexico. They went to Europe. They were very famous. We lived in an area called the Thekingsway, and the band brought a lot of prestige to the Thekingsway. The parents were very much in support of the band. The band was sort of the center of the social, all of the parties happened through the band. It was a big deal to be a part of the band. So Bob is the man who assaulted my brother. He wasn't even my brother's teacher. Really big groups. We were a big group of kids. We always had, there was a pack of us all the time. John, for 1 whole year, he groomed him. These teachers, they offer private tutoring sessions at the school. They become your biggest fan. And my brother was wildly popular. In high school, I didn't even have a name. I was just Jon Riley's sister. And John ended up, on the night that it happened in 1982, we were in 10th grade. John ended up at Bob Judge's house, and he had no idea what was in store for him. When John arrived, he's like, "Where's everyone?" And Bob said, "Oh, they're on their way." So Bob ended up drugging and giving my brother alcohol and sexually assaulting him. It was a night that changed the course of my brother's life forever. And on that night, Bob pretty much took our brother from our family. He was never the same after that night, but he didn't tell anyone what happened. So like all secrets, eventually you feel compelled to tell the secret, right? So the first person he told was Mrs. Stewart, the art teacher. So what Mrs. Stewart should have done is call the police. Bob Judge sexually assaulted my brother. She should have told the principal, and that's where the story should have ended. Mrs. Stewart didn't give my brother any compassion. Instead, her response to him, she failed him. I know that sounds like an absurd story. How do you feel, Art? Part of this story that's so hard to tell is that these men didn't just groom their victims. They groomed the other students in the band. They groomed the faculty. they groomed the community, and they groomed the parents. These were teachers of the year. They were highly celebrated and revered in our community. So when Mrs. Stewart failed my brother, he told the next person. He told the English teacher. And the English teacher's response should have been to call the police and to bring in the principal, but that's not what happened. That teacher basically told my brother, boys will be boys. I mean, he didn't use those words, but that's essentially what he told him. What happened to my brother was ripping him apart. And basically what happened next is that my parents found out. They didn't know the extent of what Bob had done to John, but let's just leave it at they understood that he was molested by him. And our father flipped out. What he wanted to do is to go to Etobicoke Collegiate and beat the shit out of Robertjudge. And we're like, no, that can't happen. Because then everyone will know. I really wish that he had of, in retrospect, now that I know the story and how it played out. That happened is that our father coincidentally played squash with the superintendent of all of the schools in the area. And he said, oh, that's just not right. So a meeting was called, and it was pretty much a gentleman's handshake behind closed doors. This should not have happened, because as a consequence of what happened in that meeting, there is no proof that it happened. This should not have happened. It sounded like a really good plan at the time. Robertjudge would leave the school and never teach again. That was the deal. But the other half of the deal was that my brother and I also had to leave the school. We were expelled. I was an honor student. We had to leave the school halfway through 11th grade. That started us both on a path that should not have happened. So essentially we went, we had to take several buses. We were walking distance to Etobicoke Collegiate. We had to take several buses to go to the new school. It was an alternative education. It was super challenging, and both my brother and I dropped out. Experienced the same anguish. When you fail your high school diploma and you don't achieve it and you get into university as a mature student, what happens is you end up feeling like you're a failure. You end up feeling like you don't belong in the school. It's a hard thing to explain. I actually graduated my first degree. I was second in my class, and I graduated summa cum laude, and I still felt like a fraud. I still felt like a failure. The identical experience happened to my brother, but because he was sexually assaulted by this man, and there was no justice. My brother ended up having a serious mental breakdown, and it began for him this journey of trying to resolve what happened to him in 1982 in 10th grade. So here's the bad part. Well, it's all bad, but this is the really bad part. Robertjudge ended up back in the same school at Etobicoke Collegiate in the same classroom, and he had more victims. So had my brother been contacted by the police and the proper channels had been handled, Robertjudge would have been incarcerated. But instead, he ended up back in the classroom. So this led to my brother having this breakdown, because he understood what it meant to be a victim of Bob's. It's so hard to tell this story. So this began what is really hard to imagine. It was a 28-year journey for my brother to get Robertjudge out of the classroom. 28 years. But in 1991, our dad died. So he was no longer a witness to what happened with the superintendent. That's pivotal to the story, because when my brother went back to Etobicoke Collegiate and told his story, they said it didn't happen. He would go by Judge's house, because obviously he knew where he lived, and he would threaten Judge. And Judge would turn around and say that my brother was crazy. It didn't happen. Look at him, he's crazy. It didn't happen. Meanwhile, Bob Judge had more victims ongoing at Etobicoke Collegiate while my brother was speaking out. He went to the police, they said it didn't happen. He went to the school, they said it didn't happen. So my brother realized that he needed to get Judge out of the classroom, and we couldn't figure out how to do it. And you know, ultimately Jon Riley is a hero, but he's never received any accolades for what he did. So this is what he did. He didn't want people to know what happened to him. He tried to resolve it for years and years and years. And he finally realized in the 2000s that the only way to get Judge out of the classroom was to say, he put his face out there and said, I'm Jon Riley, and this is what happened to me. So what we ended up doing is that we realized in the infancy of Facebook, you know, we could contact all these people we had. I live in Hawaii. I moved to Hawaii right after I graduated university. We realized we could contact all these people from the old neighborhood and all the people from the band. And so my brother devised a plan. He found an attorney that believed in him, believed his story. She was the same attorney, I don't know if you remember the scandal at Maple Leaf Gardens. There were ushers that had been sexually assaulted. Spearheaded that lawsuit. She believed my brother, and she encouraged him to start posting on Facebook. So that's what we did. I don't know if you remember hearing from me if you went to Etobicoke Collegiate. I was like, hi, I'm J. Riley. I have, that was my nickname in school. You know, my brother and I are working on a project, blah, 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 blah. You know, so we sent it out, like so many people as we could find. Then we went out to the Etobicoke Collegiate various Facebook sites, and we plastered them. We posted it everywhere. And basically the message from my brother said, I am Jon Riley. You know, Bob Judge sexually assaulted me. You don't have to tell anyone. You can stay anonymous. Just tell us. Please join our lawsuit. This is the police detective's contact information, and this is my attorney's contact information. Will you help us? Campaigned for quite some time. And then my brother got this letter. I have to read it to you. So this is the letter that my brother's attorney received from Bob Judge's attorney. And it says, we have been retained by Robertjudge to assist him in protecting his reputation while the unfounded allegations against him are being reviewed by the authorities. We are writing to advise you that Jon Riley has posted a false and defamatory message on Facebook that indicates that you are his counsel and that you have endorsed the Facebook posting. She told us to put it up there. We have now confirmed that you do act for him, and we demand that the Facebook postings and any other public allegations by Mr. Riley against Mr. Judge be removed immediately. We trust that you are aware that similar allegations were made by Mr. Riley against Mr. Judge twice in the past. This is a letter by Peter Jacobson. I've posted it online with a picture of him. Because men like Peter Jacobson, men that protect the predators, the fact that Peter Jacobson sent this letter I cannot tell you the level of devastation that Jon experienced when he read this letter. I've written to Peter Jacobson. He hasn't responded to my notes. The letter says a lot. It says that my brother spoke out, well, obviously when it happened, and Mr. Judge, he didn't include that part, that Mr. Judge left the school. That's not in his letter. Maybe Judge didn't tell him. Maybe he said, oh, I had an urge, went off to law school. Obviously didn't tell him the truth, that my father was responsible for getting Judge out of the classroom. He should have gone to jail. But it also says in this letter that my brother tried in the late 1980s, again in the 90s, and now again in the 2000s. He complained to the school board and they did nothing. He complained to the police and they did nothing. They just kept saying it didn't happen. So you can imagine now, my brother finally had, we had the ball rolling for the first time basically since it happened and Judge ended up back in the classroom. My brother had put his face out there and said, this happened to me. Can you imagine the amount of courage it took my brother to say this happened to me? After all of those years, all of the whispers, were you responsible for getting Bob Judge out of the classroom? All of this denial. There was one time when I was at university and this guy who was a year ahead of me came up to me and he said, are you Jon Riley's sister? I hadn't heard that in a while, I was at university now. I was not Jon Riley's sister. I had my own identity and I said, yeah, actually I am. And he said, I just wanted to let you know that your brother's a hero. And in that moment, I had to pretend that I didn't know what the guy was talking about. Because back then, it was all about protecting my brother. And it was all about pretending it didn't happen. So when my brother started the Facebook campaign, that was monumental for him to take ownership of what happened. But the reason he did it was not for healing. The reason he did it, because that was the only way he was going to get Bob Judge incarcerated. My brother believed that the victims, on the promise of anonymity, that they would come forward. Because if someone had offered him that, come forward anonymously, he would have signed up right away. So he just assumed that all these victims would come forward. So Bob was arrested. He turned himself in. It was in the news. Here's one. I've posted these on Facebook. Toronto CTV News. That's a big news media in Canada, in Toronto. The incident happened at the suspect's home, police allege. The suspect walked into Police 22 Division on May 21st and authorities arrested him. Investigators say there may be other victims. Robertjudge, a 58-year-old Toronto resident, why didn't they say school teacher, has been charged with indecent assault. Anyone with information is being asked to call the police or you can leave a tip, right? So when my brother had him arrested and pressed charges, it became he said against he said. Judge against Jon. The case was Jon Riley, or probably Jonathan Riley versus Robertjudge. He finally was going to get his day in court, but he didn't have anything but his truth. And I just kept telling him, just keep telling your truth, keep telling your story. It happened. And then in the 11th hour, victim after victim after victim after victim came forward and said, it happened to me too. And that was a turning point in the criminal investigation. Because these boys, some of them now men, like my brother, had the identical story of what happened to Jon. This man is a serial sexual predator. He has multiple victims over decades. This is just a handful of the victims that came forward. So you would think that they would win and Judge would finally get incarcerated, but that's not what happened. So here's where the story that the media and anyone else I said try to tell the story says we're going to get sued. So this is what happened. In pre-trial, it was determined that yes, there's all these victims. So Judge was cornered. He could no longer deny that he was a sexual predator. So with the help of his attorney, he struck a deal. We're not going to go to trial. We're going to admit that it happened. Robertjudge should be incarcerated. I keep saying that, but here's what happened. Do you remember the part where my brother tried to do something in the 80s, according to Peter Jacobson? He tried to do something in the 90s, and here we are in 2008. Well, what happened at the court in pre-trial is it was determined that the statute of limitations had expired. My brother couldn't press charges. Judge couldn't be arrested, couldn't be charged, he couldn't stand trial. So what ended up happening is he made a deal. He said that he would turn in his teaching license and never teach again. Have we heard this story before? So I have a question. Why didn't, there were victims from the 2000s. Why didn't 22 Division and Etobicoke Collegiate Institute that have denied that this has happened, and they're still denying that it happened, why didn't they press charges? Why didn't they use the victims from the 2000s that were now known and get Judge incarcerated? So this was the outcome of that pre-trial that no one can talk about because it's sealed to protect the victims. But what you can do is go on to the Ontario College of Teaching and you can look up Robertjudge, and this is what you'll see. Registration number 149038, issued, so he got a certificate, June 28 of 1974. Status, canceled, resigned. Doesn't say because he's a serial sexual predator. No mention of that, of his history. It says notation. On December 16, 2010, the member resigned his membership while disciplinary proceedings were in progress. So he resigned before they could conclude that he was a sexual predator and take away his certificate. Member undertook never to teach again in any position which requires membership in the Ontario College of Teachers, and never to seek reinstatement of his certificate. Part 2 of the legal proceedings is that my brother sued, with the help of the same attorney, the Toronto School Board. The Toronto School Board is in charge of all of the teachers in all of the schools. So that was in 2011. And in retrospect, this was a huge mistake. He should have gone to trial again, because what happens when people go to trial, I mean, we're not attorneys, we don't know this, but see, Bob Judge is an attorney and he knows this. If you don't go to trial, there's no record that it happened. So in 2011, my brother sued the Toronto School Board. He had enough evidence and they said, yikes, this really happened. But we're going to do a confidentiality clause, so you can't tell anyone. So they settled. Brother was interrogated for days on the stand in both situations. He had to tell his story again and again and again. This is what happened to me. This is what happened to me. This is what happened to me. So he ended up getting a settlement. So he won, but there's no record that it actually happened. I mean, how big was the settlement? My brother, he bought a bike and he went hiking on the El Camino in Spain, and it rained. And, you know, that was it. And so then my brother said, okay, we've got him. So John had a checklist, right? First, get Judge out of the classroom. You know, we thought that would be, we certainly didn't anticipate that would be 28 years. Mission accomplished. Judge is out of Etobicoke Collegiate Institute, still has his credentials that he can use. And I mean, this is a thing that I really want to emphasize in this story. Because the predator was protected and is still being protected by these confidentiality agreements, that these men, you know, these men don't stop. They don't stop abusing young boys. If you think that Robertjudge left Etobicoke Collegiate Institute in 2010 and has never molested another child, Judge left Etobicoke Collegiate Institute in 2010 and has never molested another child again? It's not possible. This man is tweeting from his cottage. I found him on Twitter. My aunt, who lives in Mexico, she said, you know, we call him the fucker. The fucker's on Twitter. So I went through his Twitter feed and I found predatory behavior of young boys. I've posted those on Facebook as well. I mean, what can I do to expose this man? I've tried for 40 years. The incident happened in 1982 and it's now 22. That's 40 years from the date that it happened. And I sent a scathing letter to Peter Jacobson and let him know that when you protect these predators, they just continue preying on victims. And I showed him the Twitter. I did the screenshots, and guess what? Within a week, all of the Twitter stalking and predatory behavior was removed. But I captured the screenshot. I went through his whole history. So the next step in my brother's list, the checklist, get Judge incarcerated. My brother was on a mission to incarcerate Judge when he disappeared. My brother was on a mission to incarcerate Judge when he disappeared. My brother is the only outspoken person from those victims of Etobicoke Collegiate, and he's a missing persons.